Hello and welcome. I am Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories. US President Donald Trump warns that nobody is getting off the hook for unfair trade balances, with the United States hinting at more tariffs ahead. This comes a day after the White House exempted smartphones and computers from import taxes on China. After a Russian missile strike on Ukraine's Sumy killed 34 and injured 117, Western allies slam Moscow. The United States called it horrifying, while Germany's Chancellor-in-waiting accused Russia of a war crime. Houthi-run health officials say 6 people were killed in US airstrikes near Yemen's capital Sana'a. US warplanes also launched 2 more strikes in the north of the country. Incumbent President Daniel Noboa declares victory in Ecuador's runoff election. With 90% counted, the 37-year-old Iron Fist campaign against cartel violence pushed him ahead of leftist Luisa González. China's President Xi Jinping begins his Southeast Asia tour in Vietnam amid trade tensions with the United States. Xi called for stronger industrial and supply chain partnerships. Impeached South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol faces his first criminal hearing today over insurrection charges. This follows his December 3rd decree imposing martial law. Bangladeshi authorities issue an arrest warrant for British Labour MP and ex-minister Tulip Siddiq. The niece of former PM Sheikh Hasina is wanted in a broader investigation involving her aunt. Northern Ireland's Rory McIlroy becomes just the 6th man to complete a career Grand Slam, winning the US Masters after a thrilling final round on Sunday. In a major escalation of the US-China trade standoff, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, has announced that he will unveil new tariff rates on imported semiconductors within the next week. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump made it clear that no country will be getting off the hook on tariffs, signaling a tougher stance ahead. This comes as China retaliates by halting exports of key rare earth minerals and magnets, which are very critical to global electronics, auto and defense industries. These minerals, now subject to tight export controls, could choke supply chains for American tech and military firms. Trump says the US has a $1 trillion trade deficit with China, accusing Beijing of taking hundreds of billions a year, and warning that there will be no deal unless the surplus is resolved in Europe. Trump struck a similar tone, saying the EU has taken a lot of our wealth and must pay up, not just going forward, but for the past trade imbalances too. Let's listen in to what he said on China and Europe.
But with China, it's $1 trillion, and we have to solve our trade deficit with China. We have $1 trillion trade deficit with China. Hundreds of billions of dollars a year we lose with China, and unless we solve that problem, I'm not going to make a deal. Now, I'm willing to deal with China, but they have to solve their surplus. We have a tremendous deficit problem with China. They have a surplus of at least $1 trillion a year. I think it's like $1.1 trillion. And I want that. Europe's treated us very badly. We put a big tariff on Europe. They are coming to the table. They want to talk, but there's no talk unless they pay us a lot of money on a yearly basis. Number one for present, but also for past, because they've taken a lot of our wealth away, and we're not going to allow it to happen.
We are now joined by Dr. Satoru Nagao, fellow of the Hudson Institute located in Tokyo, Japan, to discuss this further. Dr. Nagao, thank you very much for joining us. Obviously, yesterday we saw the rollback of these tariffs on smartphones and other electronic devices. This was kind of seen as an olive branch towards China. However, today we've seen Donald Trump change his mind again. Why does President Trump want new tariffs on computer chips now? And what will they do to the broader electronic market? Dr. Satoru Nagao, are you joining us? My apologies, I believe we've got some technical issues there. We will come back to the guest. Asia-Pacific markets surged on Monday following easing US tariff concerns. Japan's Nikkei 225 rose 1.82%, while Hong Kong's Hang Seng Index jumped 2.59%. South Korea's Kospi climbed 1.29%, and Australia's S&P 200 gained 0.72%. The rally came after President Trump paused tariffs on select consumer electronics, including smartphones and semiconductors, boosting investor confidence. However, Trump warned the exemptions may not be permanent, keeping uncertainty in the markets. Mainland China's CSI 300 saw a modest raise of 0.58%. Indian markets were closed for a public holiday, while trade talks with the US are set to resume this week. Moving on now, let's start with our news on the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Ukraine wakes up today reeling from a deadly Russian missile attack on the Ukrainian city of Sumy. US President Donald Trump has described Moscow's missile strike as a horrible thing. Speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump said he was told it was a mistake, though he didn't specify by whom. Let's listen in to what he had to say.
I think it was terrible, and I was told they made a mistake, but I think it's a horrible thing. I think the whole war is a horrible thing. I think the war is, for that war to have started, is an abuse of power. This country would have never allowed that war to have started if I were president. That war is a shame.
34 people and injured 83 others, including children. 2 ballistic missiles hit the city centre as people gathered for Palm Sunday. One struck a trolley bus full of passengers. This strike is one of the deadliest on Ukraine this year. The attack comes just 2 days after Trump's envoy, Steve Witkoff, met Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Meanwhile, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has invited Donald Trump to visit Ukraine to witness the devastation firsthand. This is what the Ukrainian president also stated.
Цієї п'ятниці був рівно місяць, як Росія відкинула американську пропозицію повного і безумовного припинення вогню. Вони не бояться, і саме тому балістика. Саме тому щоночі під сотню ударних дронів, більшість з яких шахедні. І саме проти звичайних українських міст.
We are now joined by Ruben Johnson, defence correspondent located in Fort Lauderdale, to discuss this further. Ruben, thank you very much for joining us. Donald Trump's famous line on this conflict is that he wants people to stop dying. This obviously comes days after US Special Envoy Steve Witkoff visited Moscow for talks. What do you think of his response so far to this catastrophic attack on the Ukrainian city of Sumy?
First of all, thank you for having me. Secondly, my reaction to what's been said about this war for months and months and months now, when people talk about attacks on Ukraine, what I say is, okay, why is this all passive voice? Why is it that we hear about the devastation in cities? We hear about the people that have died. We hear about the destruction. We hear about, but we never hear about who's responsible. You know, it's always like the ball flew over the head of the receiver, but we don't ever hear who threw the ball. This is Vladimir Putin is responsible for this war. He's responsible for this destruction. His people knew that people would be lined up in this city in Ukraine. They knew that innocent civilians would be lined up for a church service on Palm Sunday, and they deliberately launched this attack. Okay, so what's wrong here, as I've said, it's the passive voice. It's the lack of labeling the responsible parties with the guilt for committing these war crimes. That's number one. And number two is Vladimir Putin has figured out now what the equation is that the more people he kills, the greater the desire there will be in Washington to end the war. But when they say end the war, they mean putting more pressure on President Zelensky, not more pressure on Vladimir Putin.
Ruben, this obviously comes just days after Steve Witkoff was in Moscow. We obviously saw that visual of him shaking hands with the Russian president in St. Petersburg just 2 days ago. Do you think this attack could derail negotiations?
Well, I would like to think that, but I doubt that it's possible that it will happen. Because, and I want to say this is not a Donald Trump problem, okay? This is a problem of every American administration I've seen for more than 30 years, which is that when it comes to negotiations, we always give the Russians the veto on the people we want to send to speak with them, but we never get a veto on theirs. So in true tradition, going back to, I don't know how long, when Trump said my envoy is General Keith Kellogg, the Russians said, oh, we don't want to deal with him. He's too pro-Ukraine. He's too much of a hardliner. And so Trump sends one of his real estate cronies who has no experience in foreign relations. So, you know, these negotiations, you say, could they be derailed? I'm not sure they were ever on the rails to begin with.
Ruben, President Zelensky has obviously invited President Donald Trump to go actually visit Ukraine. Do you think he'll go? What such of a trip do you think that this could achieve if he does?
I'd love for President Trump to see the destruction in this country, because I lived there for 21 years and almost died in the war. I'd love for him to see everything that's going on. I'd love for him to see what's happened to so many people's lives and the number of families who've been torn apart because one part of the families had to leave the country. But I doubt that it will happen, because I don't think the American Secret Service, the president's security service, will permit that kind of a visit to take place in this environment.
Ruben, what did you think of Europe's response? You've had the Britain, and you've obviously had Chancellor in waiting, Friedrich Merz, calling this a war crime. What do you think of the response from Europe, from Ukraine's European allies?
Well, as an American, I'm terribly embarrassed that from the beginning of this war, the United Kingdom has been out in front of everybody else. Boris Johnson was the first Western leader to visit Kiev. The United Kingdom media, particularly the Telegraph, who have a daily podcast called Ukraine the Latest, have covered this war front to back in a way that the American media has not. All of the European allies, not the Germans necessarily, but the United Kingdom, some of the other smaller NATO members, particularly France, President Macron has become an outspoken advocate for Ukraine and has sent some weapons that have been very, very critical in this war, particularly recently. And of course, the French and the United Kingdom are talking about putting boots on the ground. So if it wasn't for the Ukrainian response, I think Ukraine would be doomed.
What is the kind of, you said you were on the ground in Ukraine. What kind of destruction are you seeing there firsthand from the people of Ukraine during this conflict?
Well, the stuff that I've seen, I mean, first of all, we've had entire cities that have been leveled. We've seen immense damage to infrastructure, particularly energy infrastructure. The Russians have targeted power plants and other energy facilities so that people would be freezing during the winter. As a matter of fact, if you're in downtown Kiev, sometimes the only sound that you can hear on the streets is the sort of low-level hum of all of the petrol-powered generators that are running because of the constant electricity outages. We're seeing destruction to basically everything in everyday life. I mean, I don't know, can you imagine a country with the size of Ukraine that for over 3 years now, there has been no commercial air service of any kind? If you want to travel from Kiev to Warsaw, which is the nearest major city where you can actually get on an airplane to fly somewhere, it's a 15-hour journey. And this has been going on and on and on. And it just seems to be people are now desensitized. They're either desensitized or they say, oh, well, you know, this is just what the Russians do. You know, this is what they do.
Ruben Johnson, thank you very much for joining us. Very informative as always. We move to the Indo-Pacific now, where Chinese President Xi Jinping has kicked off a tour of Southeast Asia, starting in Vietnam. It's his first trip abroad this year and comes amid growing global trade tensions with the United States. Writing in a Vietnamese state newspaper, Xi warned that protectionism leads nowhere. He also said that trade wars have no winners, a clear swipe at US tariffs under President Donald Trump. Additionally, Xi also called for deeper regional cooperation. He said that China and Vietnam should work together to keep global supply chains open and defend free trade. He also touched on a sensitive issue, the maritime disputes in the South China Sea. Xi said that differences should be settled through dialogue and negotiation, and that both countries should safeguard peace in the region. Vietnam remains one of China's top trading partners in Southeast Asia, but tensions run high over Beijing's claims in the disputed South China Sea. After Vietnam, Xi will head to Malaysia and then to Cambodia. Beijing says that these tours are key to strengthening regional ties as China seeks to position itself as a stable global partner. Let's turn to the Middle East now, where an Israeli airstrike has destroyed parts of Al Ali Hospital in Gaza City, which is Gaza's only fully operational hospital in the north. Let's take a listen to what a hospital worker had to say.
مستشفى الأهل العرب المعمداني لاستقبال الطوارئ. في الليلة اللي فاتت تم تحذير المستشفى بالإخلاء. قسم الاستقبال والطوارئ، وحدة الإسعافات الأولية، أيضا الصيدلية، أيضا المختبر، كله تم تدميره بالكامل. في الليلة اللي فاتت الساعة 2 في الليل تم تحذير المستشفى بالإخلاء، فتم إجلاء الكوادر الطبية والمرضى وجميع الأفراد الطاقم.
Palestinian civil defense officials say the strike happened around 2 a.m., damaging the surgery building and wiping out the oxygen supply system used in intensive care. No casualties were reported inside the hospital, but Gaza's health ministry says one child died during a rushed evacuation. Hospitals protected under international law have been hit multiple times since the war began in October 2023. Israel say Hamas embeds fighters in hospitals, claims Hamas denies. Meanwhile, Israel is tightening its grip on northern Gaza and cutting off Rafah in the south, pushing mass evacuations and increasing pressure to secure a hostage deal. Hamas says hostages will only be released by political decision, not military force. Let's go deeper into Israel now, where Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is slamming French President Emmanuel Macron over his push to recognize a Palestinian state, calling him gravely mistaken. In a statement, Netanyahu said that any Palestinian state would be a state whose sole aspiration is the destruction of Israel. His remarks came in response to Macron's recent comments suggesting France could officially recognise a Palestinian state within months, possibly during a UN conference in June. Macron says he hopes the move would trigger broader recognition of Israel by Arab nations. Facing backlash from white right-wing groups in France. Macron later clarified that he supports the rights of both Palestinians and Israelis to peace, security and mutual recognition. France has long supported a two-state solution to the conflict. Let's move on now, where Yemen's Houthi rebels say they have fired 2 ballistic missiles at Israel, targeting a military base and an airport. The group claims one missile was aimed at Sadot Michar base near Ashdod and another at the Ben Gurion International Airport near Tel Aviv. Israeli forces confirmed that a missile was launched from Yemen and said that it was successfully intercepted. Air raid sirens were heard across Israel, including in Jerusalem, but no damage or injuries have been reported. The Houthis have been launching missiles and drones towards Israel since the war in Gaza began last October, saying they are in support of Palestinians. Attacks temporarily stopped during a ceasefire in January, but then resumed after Israel restarted its offensive in March. Let's take a listen to what Houthi military spokesman Yahya Sari had to say.
غزة نفذت القوة الصاروخية في القوات المسلحة اليمنية عملية عسكرية نوعية، وذلك بصاروخين باليستيين، أحدهما فرط صوتي نوع فلسطين 2 استهدف قاعدة سودة ميخا في منطقة شرق أسدود المحتلة، وهي قاعدة صاروخية لإطلاق صواريخ أريحة وبطاريات صواريخ حيدس. والصاروخ الآخر نوع ذي الفقار استهدف مطار بن غوريون في منطقة يافا المحتلة.
Meanwhile, the Houthi rebels say that an American airstrike has killed 6 people and injured more than a dozen others. The strike hit a factory in Sana'a province. Houthi media says the total number of victims has risen to 19, with 6 dead and 13 wounded. The US also carried out strikes in other parts of Yemen, including Sada and Hodeida provinces. America started targeting the Houthi areas in March after the rebels began attacking ships in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. The conflict has disrupted shipping in one of the world's most important trade routes, forcing many vessels to take longer, more expensive detours. Let's move to Africa now, where Sudan's paramilitary rapid support forces claim to have taken full control of Zamzam camp in Darfur, a site ravaged by famine and conflict. This is what the paramilitary leader stated.
بنشر وحدات عسكرية لتأمين المدنيين والعاملين في الحقل الطبي والإنساني في مخيم زمزم بولاية شمال دارفور بعد تمكنها من تحرير معسكر زمزم بشكل كامل من قبضة جيش الحركة الإسلامية الإرهابية وتوابعها من حركات الارتزاق المسلح التي كانت تتخذ المعسكر ثكنة عسكرية والمدنيين دروع.
The RSF launched intense ground and aerial assaults on Friday, targeting the camp and nearby areas, killing at least 200 people, including children and aid workers. The United Nations warned the toll could be much higher as entire medical teams and civilians were targeted. Zamzam is one of 5 regions where famine has been officially detected. Paramilitaries were seen torching buildings while alleging that Sudanese armed forces were using the camp as a human shield. This marks some of the worst violence in Darfur since Sudan's civil war erupted nearly 2 years ago. The RSF denies it's targeted civilians, but eyewitnesses and agencies report mass killings and destruction. The US has condemned atrocities by both sides, accusing the RSF of genocide and the army of attacking civilians. Moving on, a Wisconsin teenager is facing multiple charges after killing his parents as part of a broader plot to assassinate US President Donald Trump. The FBI says 17-year-old Nikita Kassap shot his mother and stepfather in early February near a village in Milwaukee. He then fled with their car, cash and a gun. Investigators say the teen's phone contained neo-Nazi materials, praise for Adolf Hitler and writings outlining a violent plan to overthrow the US government. Authorities also say he communicated with individuals in Russia and planned to escape to Ukraine. He allegedly intended to use drones and explosives in an attack. Kassab has been charged with first-degree homicide and 7 other felonies. He's being held on a $1 million bond and is due back in court on May the 7th. Back over to the Indo-Pacific, where the trial of South Korea's ousted leader Yoon Suk-yeol began today. Yoon faces charges of insurrection after declaring martial law late last year, triggering months of political turmoil. Prosecutors argue that Yoon lacked legal grounds to declare martial law and accused him of trying to paralyze state institutions, including parliament. Yoon has denied all charges, claiming the move was necessary to combat what he called legislative dictatorship by the opposition. If convicted of insurrection, Yoon could face life imprisonment or even death, though executions have not occurred in South Korea for decades. The trial follows Yoon's removal from office earlier this month by the Constitutional Court for violating constitutional powers. Meanwhile, South Korea will hold a snap election on June the 3rd as questions remain over Yoon's future role. Well, that's all we have time for. We will continue to bring you more global news updates.